So let me take a moment to introduce you to David. David arrived on campus yesterday, and later tonight his film, The Diplomat, will be screened. It's an account in 3 parts about Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, his dad, and I'll say more about Richard Holbrooke in a moment. In addition to The Diplomat, David's other films include Hard as Nails, Freaks Like Me.
Freaks Like Me.
Time for New God, and a Redwood Grows. You might see my New York accent comes out there.
There we go, in Brooklyn.
A Redwood Grows in Brooklyn. And David is also the festival director of Telluride Mountain Film in Colorado, and he's done long-form journalism for CNN, The Today Show, and many other places. My sources tell me...
What is this crap? Can I read this?
A serious extreme sports fanatic.
Oh, it's so untrue.
Hiking, mountain climbing, and off-track downhill skiing. Is that true?
I don't even know what that is. Somebody's reading the wrong bio. But anyway, I live in Telluride, Colorado. We do a lot of fun stuff like that. So yeah, I like to play outside, but I would not call me serious or extreme or fanatic, but nonetheless, at least when it comes to the sports. But thank you. Hey, I buy it. I'm go with it. I found a new publicist once again.
And I want to thank John Vickers from IU Cinema and our friends in the media school for bringing David here. It's really a pleasure. I'm really glad you could join us.
Thank you all.
So I had the privilege of hosting David for dinner last night, and some of you were in the room as well. And we learned a couple of things which I think are relevant to our conversation today. And since many of the people in this room won't have seen your film until later tonight, I just want
Is there anybody who has seen it here? You have. Cool. Right on. Excellent.
So we discovered last night that we had a few students at dinner. We discovered that they were born the same year or after your dad's greatest diplomatic achievement, which was ending the wars in the Balkans. So just very briefly, as some of you who may not be familiar with Ambassador Holbrooke's career, he started as a Foreign Service officer at age 22, cutting his teeth working in Vietnam.
And he landed there, just to fill in May 1st, 1963. So President Kennedy was president. So the beginning of the Vietnam War, not the end, which was a very different perspective.
And he was the youngest Assistant Secretary of State in the history of the Department of State, serving as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific during the administration of President Jimmy Carter, and during the Clinton administration, in which I served and overlapped with Richard Holbrooke. He was ambassador to Germany. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Maybe one of the only people to be an assistant secretary for different regional bureaus. And he was also America's ambassador to the United Nations. He negotiated the Dayton Accords in 1995, and Dayton is not very far away, and it's really worth a road trip. There's a museum commemorating the event, as well as some cool aviation at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's worth a visit if you're interested. In 2009, President Obama and Secretary Clinton appointed him to be Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was easily the toughest diplomatic job assignment for the Obama years. David's dad passed away in December 13th, and pursuing literally until his last moments a path towards reconciliation to end the war, also wars in Afghanistan.
Coming up in 6 years since his death.
So I wanted to tell all of you who are from the school or elsewhere on campus that around the table and on this campus there are many people who've had personal contact or whose lives were affected in some way, direct or otherwise, by David's dad. Somebody I know well in the media school, Elaine Monahan, is a professor of practice.
You mean your wife?
My wife.
Got it.
Who covered who covered Ambassador Holbrooke as a State Department reporter, and also while covering the war in the Balkans, and in particular in Kosovo. Professor of practice Mark Minton, who was effectively Richard's deputy at the United Nations from 1999 to 2001, and many others. And you must see this all the time. I mean, when you go, wherever you go, your dad's impact reached so many people, and through your film.
Very much so. Look, he was this big figure, and what people who told me, who worked for him, said that, if they worked for him this much, he took up that much of their time and their space and their bandwidth, because that's who he was. And I really felt it. I went to Vietnam. I went to 9 countries making this film, including all the places he had worked heavily, Vietnam and Afghanistan. But where I really felt his impact the most was in Bosnia. And he was really the architect of ending the war there, which was incredibly complicated and challenging. And then it was also in Kosovo. He worked for the president as a special envoy to Kosovo. And what he did there really was, his work was quicker and cleaner than it was in Bosnia. And so when I went to Kosovo with the movie, both to film and then to go back to screen it, it was amazing. People came up to me all the time saying, Holbrooke? Oh, your father is a founding father of this country. Holbrooke? Oh, I'm giving the guy my passport to leave the country. And he looks at me, Holbrooke? He said, Richard? I said, yeah, that's my father. He said, oh, he's number one here. And there was that kind of thing that somebody came up to me and said, we would not be here today were it not for the work of your father. So it was an incredible odyssey. And then there are all the people who he touched along the way, and he could get a lot done. He had had his own sort of power. He had all these things. I remember some guy came up to me after he died, and he said, I just want you to know your father changed my life. I said, oh, how'd that happen? And he said, he was at a university, came to speak, and I asked him about this program I wanted to start. It was an international program, and he said, my father talked to him while doing this. My father was easily distracted and seemed to be paying no attention to him, but this poor kid's earnestly trying to pitch him his thing, and after about 2 minutes of getting through it, my father said, so this is what you want to do this? Oh, I can help you with that. And he did. And the kid said, the program's going, and now it's fully rolling, and it never would have happened without that rocket fuel from my father. And so one of the themes in the film is the sacrifices one needs to make for a life of public service, or really any service. You want to be a great filmmaker, you want to do whatever, it's going to take you away from your family. And, as my brother says in the film, he could have been, there are a lot of absent fathers. Where are they absent to? He was absent mostly in war zones. He was absent in places I thought really made a difference. And to me, that's always a point of pride. It's also a point of pain sometimes, because I certainly didn't get enough of him and my children and so on. But in the end, it was for a reason that I think was really worthwhile. And so for me, the film was an exercise in a bunch of things, but largely, could I access and understand and ultimately tell this story that spanned 5 decades, countless countries, and tell it in a way that a movie needs to be told with both clarity and humor, with insight and with all these things. And it was I think as movies go, it was a pretty high degree of difficulty. All movies are hard to make. This one was particularly so. But it also, as hard as it was to make, the process of showing has been enormously gratifying. And be here at this amazing campus on this summer day is really a pleasure. I show up a little sweaty. I saw that documentary about IU, what was it, Breaking Away? And I thought there were bikes everywhere, and so I walked over here, but it was sort of showed up sweaty, so I apologize for that. But I always say there are 3 reasons I made this movie. One, I wanted his grandchildren to understand better who he was. And one child came with me to Bosnia and Kosovo and Afghanistan. Another one of my children came with me to Vietnam. So that it was achieved. I felt he had something more to say about the world we live in, and it's true. About Afghanistan, you'll see it in the film. And then ultimately, I wanted him to inspire another generation of diplomats. Diplomacy is hugely important. And you guys are here. We're in this school, which is amazing. This place, this institution. These are smart people, but there are countless smart people out there who aren't being taught what diplomats do. Go into any classroom. I said this last night. Any classroom and say, hey, what does a soldier do? And everybody's hand will shoot up. And you say, hey, what does a diplomat do? And they'll come down pretty quickly. And this film has helped on that front. People understand what this work is. They understand why it matters. And for those of you in this school particularly, you know, God bless for being here and caring about this, because diplomats are always essential and probably never more so than now, which is, of course, why our next Secretary of State will be Rudy Giuliani. Which is hard to process given how committed he was to his work, and I don't see the same seriousness of purpose, but I do hope that when you watch the film, you look, okay, this is important. How the hell do we do this? From whatever political persuasion, how do we do it? Because diplomacy, as you know, as a diplomat yourself, is essential.
So I want to let people ask questions, but I want to just engage you a little bit. By the way, you're absolutely right. People say, what is it that you actually do as an ambassador? And people really don't have an idea of what it is to be a diplomat. But we talked a little bit about this last night, and it was so interesting. I hope you can maybe we can reprise the conversation. Why did you call the film The Diplomat? It's kind of a milquetoast title, but as I was saying last night, I felt it was a provocation on your part, and a really important one.
A little bit. I mean, we're being literal to a point, but we're also saying, you know, that word, diplomat, what does it mean and why does it matter? We considered calling the film undiplomatic because my father was very undiplomatic in a lot of ways. He, you know, was a bull in a china shop. His nickname when he was in Bosnia was the bulldozer. And diplomats are, you know, the Washingtonian magazine once wrote that my father single-handedly defied the notion that all diplomats need to be impeccably dressed. You know, he was this hair and these clothes, and he just didn't really. It wasn't, and there's not there. You know, being an ambassador, there's protocol. You have a protocol officer, somebody who just does protocol. How do we behave? How do we? And my father would have just blown through all of that, but he still would have pulled it off, and he would have blown through it by being his kind of intemperate self. But in the end, it kind of worked, and it worked most really in Bosnia, because his undiplomatic approach was what got things done.
So also, though, you know, he negotiated, shook hands with, broke bread with, spent a lot of time with
some bad people.
Milosevic, just to name one, somebody indicted by the International Criminal Court and responsible for the worst kinds of atrocities.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the message that you were making in the film.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you know, his book, which is terrific, called To End a War, about his time in Bosnia, he talks about the scene. He'd been dealing with Milosevic, who was the president of Serbia, as well as the presidents of Croatia and Bosnia. But there were two henchmen's the wrong word, but two Bosnian Serbs, Radovan Karadzic and Mladic, Ratko Mladic, who were really bad guys. Like Milosevic was a bad guy. This was another level of bad. I don't know how it gets that way, but he had this negotiation with Milosevic, who he had dealt with. And Milosevic, sort of like at some point in this meeting, was up at a hunting lodge. It's somewhere in Bosnia or in Serbia, and a door opens and out walk Mladic and Karadzic, indicted war criminals, being prosecuted, all the really bad guys. And he had known this might happen. He had told his staff. He said, "It's up to you. It's to you and your own conscience whether you choose to shake hands with these monsters." And you know, it was something that he had to wrestle with. But in the end, I mean, it's something we have a quote in the film of Hillary Clinton saying, you know, your father and I always used to say, you don't make peace with your friends. You don't make peace with your friends. And so that idea of having to deal with these people was essential. And you know, if we flash forward to the Obama administration, my father came into that job, special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, as the point person to go to these places and to negotiate theoretically peace. But as one of his aides says in the film, that reconciliation, the idea of sitting down with these people and negotiating peace, was a dirty word in the Obama administration for the first year. It was going to look like we were soft. It was going to look all these things, and we couldn't sit down with the Taliban. And my father was like, we have to sit down with the Taliban. We can't get there if we don't eventually sit down with them, because we can't keep bombing them to hell. It doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. And so for him, it was always that whatever we were going to use as this great country, you know, what were we going to use that would get us to the peace table? And as awful as some of the things that these people had done, he ultimately knew, you know, it wasn't our country. They were the sovereign powers. How are we going to negotiate with them to bring about the best solution. And you know this so well, Lee, that diplomacy is inherently not perfect, not far from. The idea that you're taking these people with such disparate interests, find them, trying to get them together is a problem. And in Bosnia, as it were, he ended the war, and the Dayton Peace Agreements, which ended that war, were intended to start the peace, end the killing, start a society, and have these people living together again. And my father dove in deeply to currencies, to telephone exchanges, to police forces, all these things that he thought mattered. But what he really saw the Dayton Peace Accords as a transitional document to end the war, start the peace. And here we are in 2016, and that has become their de facto constitution, which drove him nuts at the end of his life and would make him even more frustrated. But basically, the politicians took that and took the parts that worked for them and create a system that's quite untenable. And I was filming in Srebrenica in 2000, and what year was I? 13. We were there in that summer, and I saw somebody walking around with this T-shirt with giant letters that said "Anti-Dayton." That's all it said, "Anti-Dayton." I'm like, what the hell? And I wanted to interview him, and I was kind of a jerk. I sandbagged him a little. I'm like, tell me what's the matter with Dayton. Tell me what's the matter. I'm like, I'm Richard Holbrooke's son. And it's they're like, what? And I didn't end up not using because it just didn't make sense in the film. But Dayton, to many people there, is a albatross. And they're not wrong. But I know that my father's intent was for it to be a transitional document. And that's the inherently messy and deeply imperfect nature of diplomacy.
So my last question, and then I'd like to turn to all of you. So Dayton had this sort of meaning in one word in the Balkans. So to people in this room, Vietnam also has that.
Sure.
But it's a shorthand for a lot of things in people's minds. For your dad, obviously, it's a formative experience, and as you correctly pointed out, he was here very early on, and it shaped his thinking in terms of his approach to the AFPAC problem. Can you say a little bit more about that? What did Vietnam? What were the lessons, if I can put it that way, Vietnam, from your dad's perspective?
Several. There's a letter he wrote home to my mother that's in the film. He said that people 12,000 miles away in Washington can't be making smart decisions about what's happening on the ground here. Pre-internet, pre-all this, 1965. He lands in 63. I'm born in 65, and what he knew was that he'd see Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, coming to Vietnam, being brought in literally almost, well, not literally, but helicoptered into this village where basically a stage play has been constructed for him that has, elements of the real and elements of the not. How do we figure out what it is? And so for my father, who was living this war in the Mekong Delta, civilian, he was the only civilian in the Mekong Delta, which was VC territory at the time. And they gave him a gun, which is hysterical if you knew my father. That's ridiculous. The only thing I think he ever shot was a Jeep by mistake. That it was, he just had no idea what he was doing on that. He was also really young, but he lived there. He saw it. He was there. And that's the thing I think that is really tricky for diplomats today. I went to Afghanistan, went to Kabul, and interviewed the ambassador there in the green zone. Had to go through more security than I've ever been to get my gear in, to get my crew in, and all of that. And there's this amazing place in Afghanistan. Kabul's surrounded by these hills, and there's something called Swimming Pool Hill, which we had filmed at. And the Russians, when they occupied it, the Russian generals loved to swim. Who knew? They built this giant swimming pool, Olympic size, diving boards, the whole thing. And now it's just surrounded by a fence, and it's abandoned. The Taliban used the pool to push people off the diving board from the deep end, from the high dive into a waterless pool. So here's this thing, and so at the ambassador's residence, I look out, oh look, there's Swimming Pool Hill. You can see the pool, you can see the diving board. And I said, have you been up there? And he said, no, I haven't. I said, I can't. I said, why not? Wouldn't you want to see it? He said, for me to leave this building, for me to leave this compound, is literally a military operation. And so my father, when he went into the Obama administration, it was the same way with Clinton. He went from, the lessons from Vietnam where you have to be on the ground, you have to see it. So as a private citizen in the 90s, he's going to Bosnia. He's writing about the Washington Post. He's seen ethnic cleansing up front. He knows what this is, and he's talking about it as a private citizen. And so he can do and say and go where he wants. And for him, that was everything. When he gets to Afghanistan, and he went to Afghanistan several times as a private citizen, but when he goes as a diplomat, his schedule is meeting this general and this minister and all these people who are at whatever altitude rather than farmers and families. And he loved to go to markets, loved to walk through markets. And that's where he learned what was really going on. And I think that's a huge part of what he wanted to do. And he listened to people. He listened to farmers, but he also listened to journalists. He was always known as a great source, that my father was leaking. But it was partly true and it partly wasn't. What he was doing is saying, hey, journalists, what do you know? What have you seen? Because you're out there and you're looking at things. If you look at the people who are bringing attention to Bosnia in the early 1990s, is Samantha Power, then a journalist, is John Burns from Bosnia, Sebastian Younger. It's all these different people who were saying, wait, we're seeing things on the ground, and what can I learn from you? And that was always such a hallmark of what he believed about, that he learned in Vietnam. Be on the ground, see what's happening, and try and make a difference best you can.
Which is an interesting way to think about what a diplomat's job is, and not what everybody thinks about when they think about diplomats. They think about place settings and who's sitting where, which is also part of the job, but
yeah,
not the full picture.
When I showed the film and got it on HBO and all that, I've gotten a bunch of lovely notes from people who were inspired to be a diplomat because of that. And I got a couple of hate things, and this one guy wrote in a whole bevy of misspellings that all my father did was go around on the government's dime and party. I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what he was doing. Just going from one party to another, one party in Sarajevo to another party in Srebrenica to another party in Kandahar. These are places, it's a real circuit that he took. But that he was committed, and he was committed. He believed in the power of diplomacy. He believed in American power, and I think a way that doesn't entirely fit with mine. But he believed he was a patriot. He was a patriot, and it's a film that's not used. It's a word that's not used in the film. But he believed that America had a unique and a right to be exceptional, a need to be exceptional. What that means, we can interpret it in a variety of ways. But for him, ultimately, it was that we could, be a force for good. And if you look in Vietnam, he fully was aware that Vietnam was a colossal mess. We had made huge missteps. And if you bookend and say in Afghanistan, it's the same thing. If you look at Bosnia, where there were problems, but relatively, it didn't take much American power to stop that war. And we could have sooner, and Clinton could have sooner, but he did not for a variety of reasons. And in the end, my father, who's at his wit's end, was able to convince the president to authorize NATO airstrikes against the Bosnian Serbs, and like that, we're to ceasefire. And to the point where, it just didn't take that much, but it did take Srebrenica, 7,000 people. It took the bombing of a Sarajevo marketplace in August of 1995 that killed 70-some-odd people who were getting fruit and vegetables. It took the shelling of a third-grade classroom in Sarajevo where 30 third graders were killed. It took all that, but eventually, once Americans said, to hell with this, we've got to stop this. And they did, and to Clinton's credit, he was late to the party, but when he showed up, he did the right thing. And I think if you look at the summer of 1995, it's the summer before a re-election year, and this is a politically minded White House, they all are, but this one particularly so, the kind of people who are polling where they're going to go on summer vacation, that kind of thing. And it's an economy-driven message. And here they say, against the president's domestic and White House advisors, Bill Clinton says, yeah, you're right, we got to do this. And I think there was a relentless amount of criticism towards him. He had also run on this in 1992 against George W. Bush. It's not doing enough, but then, like George H.W. Bush, he didn't do enough until he's really forced into it. And then, it changes. Imperfectly, but it changes.
And it's as you say, it's imperfect, but it's held.
It's held. It's fragile. It's tenuous, and there are a lot of bad actors there who would love to see this become a thing again. And let's just imagine that. One of the things I also hoped with the film was that it would bring attention to Bosnia. And, who's been there? Yeah, you might have been there, huh? I love your movie, by the way. Yeah, and I think that the movie that you made, The Hunting Party, brought attention to this area. Like, Bosnia is such a easy thing to forget. Here we are, in Europe, this little place, but it's pivotal in so many ways, geographically, geopolitically, all these other things, and I think it's just misunderstood. And we also like Dayton. First of all, I didn't really understand what happened in that war 20 years ago. Who were the good guys? I forget. That's really easy to lose track of that. Number one, and then okay, we did it. We're good, and I know Americans, we're good at short attention span. We're not great at that follow-up, and here we are with a country that is such a tinderbox. And in 1995, Boris Yeltsin and Russia were flat. I'm not sure if Yeltsin was still in. He was still, but he was really, Russia was really. They were all on their back, and they said, "Okay, Bosnia, we're just going to forget about it." Vladimir Putin will not say we're going to forget about it. He's supported Serbia throughout. Their new, not so new, but the Prime Minister Dodic is a nationalist. Economic conditions are different, and we know that Russia will fully support Serbia. So if this pops up again, the stakes, everything's going to be so much higher than they were in 1990s, a time when 200,000 people were killed, 1 million plus refugees. And, I don't begin to understand how we'll figure out it. And what I really, it was kind of not a secret hope, but I really wanted the Clintons to say, okay, that was part of our legacy. Let's pay attention to it. And it wouldn't take a lot of American attention and resolve to say, okay, we care about this region. It's important that it remains stable. But instead, this current administration has done nothing on it. And I'd be shocked if the next administration does anything about it, unless it catches on fire, and then everybody will look towards it and be like, oh, okay, we got a problem. But how they solve that problem, I don't begin to know.
All right, so we've got students, faculty, people from our community, and so please ask away and just let us know who you are before asking your question.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing the film.
Hey, appreciate it.
My name's Adam Left. I teach on East Asia here.
Right on.
So you mentioned earlier in your remarks that there are aspects of your father's personality for which he was famous. One of them was the situation being the user term on diplomatic. And you hinted that sometimes that worked. But I imagine that there are also times in perhaps particular cultural context where it
Sure.
backfired. Can you provide any
Yeah.
anecdotes to illustrate that side of it?
Yeah, one quickly, and this is more, I don't know, self-interested. 1995, he ends a war that nobody could end. And the way he did it was brusque. He was tough with the leaders of the countries, but he was also tough, brusque, rude to the Europeans, whose region it was, and who had done nothing on the war. Roger Cohen, the great New York Times columnist, wrote in his book, he said, Bosnia was passed back and forth between Europe and the United States like a poisoned chalice. And so Europe hadn't stepped up, America hadn't stepped up, nobody was really doing anything. Finally, we do this. And so my father was, to hell with you Europeans, you haven't done anything. And his treatment, they hated it. And I understand why, he must have been such a jerk to them. But he just didn't have any patience, too much was at stake. And so when you come around to the next year and they're looking back at Nobel Peace Prize winners, he was a clear, everybody who knows more about me tells me he should have won that year. I don't remember who did win it, but it was relatively obscure. But basically, his own brusque and rough personality pushed all the Euros away. Like, screw that, we're not going to vote for this. That's a facile and sort of personal. It would have been cool for him to get that, and he would have, I felt he deserved it. More importantly was really in 2009, he goes in, he's appointed, he's Special Representative of Afghanistan, Pakistan, goes to see Hamid Karzai, the president of the country, and basically pushes him around and is obnoxious. He thinks he's got that support from the White House, but he doesn't. He thinks he's got all these things that he doesn't have, and he treats the Afghans. And we have this great quote in the film from the current president, Ashraf Ghani, saying, you might be able to push around Milosevic, but you can't do that with an Afghan. He said, you can kill an Afghan with cotton, but not with a sword. kill an Afghan with cotton, but not with a sword. I'm still like, well, what does that all mean? But basically, he came in there entirely undiplomatically. And don't forget, Joe Biden, who had come in as vice president-elect, had been at a dinner with the president of Afghanistan and was so outraged by what he was hearing, got up, threw his napkin on the table, and walked out. Not very diplomatic either. But he was the vice president. My father's lack of diplomatic tact in that really set him back. And it set him back for a couple of reasons. One, you shouldn't talk to a sitting president that way, and he did. But more, unfortunately, from my perspective, Karzai complained to the White House. And you got to remember, Karzai had weekly calls with George W. Bush, whatever they did, teleconference. They were buds. Obama came in and was like, oh, that's not going to be happening, but I'm going to send this guy over. And my father got in their face. They said, what the hell? And then they called the White House and said, what the hell? And the White House said, don't worry about him. They basically undercut my father and marginalized him in a way that I understand, but still frustrates me, still makes me mad, because it was unnecessary, it was humiliating, it was unprofessional, it was all these things. But it was my father's initial lack of diplomatic tact that really figured that out. And that's what he did. He didn't get it, and he was so smart and such a force that he didn't understand what was happening. Somebody who knew him compared him to George C. Scott in Patton when he's walking across the battlefield and stuff's just blowing up. He's like, we're going here, we're going there. And he has no idea of the trail of tears behind him. And he did that. And he did that to people who were on his side. This was less diplomatic and more almost political. But as things start to get more and more challenging for him in the Obama administration, it's not just Afghanistan and Pakistan that are impossible, but it's the White House that's impossible for him. And the film goes into this in some depth. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And he was paranoid, and his sure-footedness that had worked so well for him in, every administration he'd worked in, all of a sudden, it was like the music changed. You'd been dancing to jazz, and now it wasn't. It was, whatever it was, it just was off, and he didn't know how to figure it out. And his own, God, it sounds so primal, but in a way, his own wounded animal was, and it wasn't, instead of, I got to figure out how to work with these people, he was, and the problems coming at him from South Asia were the problems from South Asia. Boy, that's hard, and it's one thing, like, to not get along with your boss. It's another thing not to get along with your boss when he's the President of the United States. And to me, that is, we talked about last night, the real tragedy in a way of the film, in that I don't know if my father had been left to figure this out. Like the Clintons, President Clinton said, go do this, do it, and by any means, but you have our authority, we have our support, you speak for us. And that's not what happened in this administration. In fact, it was the opposite. And for my father, a patriot, a veteran of all this diplomacy, and was completely sideswiped by it. He knew, as you said, the hardest job in the administration, but he didn't know that what was going to make that job so hard was the lack of support from the White House. And just quickly, if things were great today, if he had been marginalized, cut out, and things worked great, I'd be like, okay, you guys were right. He was the wrong guy, he had the wrong approach. But, smart people in this room, if anybody has a sense of what our Afghan policy is, I'd love to know, because literally since my father died 6 years ago, it's been pretty opaque and not that he could crystallize it, but at least he could articulate something that nobody in the administration has been able to since.
In 2007, when I first started working with your dad, on Hillary Clinton's first run for the presidency, he came in with this idea that nobody else had expressed, which was this idea that you can't address the problems in Afghanistan.
That's
you
right.
don't understand the problems in Pakistan, and you don't try to address them, and more broadly in South Asia.
That's
and
right.
so he had articulated the strategy early.
You have to look at that, and that was SRAP, Special Representative Afghanistan, Pakistan. That was new, and it could have been SRAPI, India, or a Srapi, Iran. Let's add a C in there for China. And that to him, ultimately, that's where he was getting towards the end of his life. As I understood from the people who knew him, there had to be a grand bargain. To make Afghanistan work, you couldn't just be Afghanistan. To make Afghanistan work, it couldn't actually just be AfPak. It had to be the regional powers, with the U.S. playing some sort of unifying and positive role to bring diplomats from all these regions. And the way my father approached diplomacy was, yes, it was, people in suits or talking about making peace, but it was also agriculture. And his office, the Special Representative's office, was really notable for bringing in people from the Justice Department. He had somebody from Homeland Security on his team because he knew that he would need somebody from agriculture, from all these different departments, all centered in the White House, all centered in the State Department. On the first floor of the State Department, which is exactly where the power isn't. The higher up you go in the State Department, the higher up the power.
It was right down the hall from the cafeteria.
Which he loved. He put on too much weight, but he loved that. And for him, that was the essential. Homeland Security, there was a Pakistani general coming to meet, important meeting, and he said, if I get off the plane at Dulles and I get the full rubber glove treatment, I'm out of here. I'm getting on the next plane going out of this country. And my father said, hey, Homeland Security guy who works for me, get out to Dulles Airport and make sure the Pakistani general gets through in a diplomatic way, in a way that, that they might not know there. And so he was using all the various elements of the government. When I was in Afghanistan, I interviewed an agriculture minister who said he spent all this time with my father in fields. He didn't understand why he wanted to always go out to these fields if he could. In Pakistan, they called him Dr. Pomegranate because he was trying so hard to get pomegranates grown to replace poppies in places. And, he was looking at all these things. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm from the State Department, I study foreign policy, and that's what this is about. It's like, how do people live? And how do we make their lives better? And that's how he saw being a diplomat. Yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to a journalist at the governing board in Afghanistan dealt with some of your father's team. My question is, I hope you can recount the path of how he became a special ambassador in that life.
For Afghanistan. Yeah. So basically, he wanted to be Secretary of State. He interviewed to be Secretary of State. That did not go well. He clearly wasn't going to get that job. He didn't have the rapport with the president. And I look at it a little bit like some sort of sports team. I haven't figured out the analogy perfectly or the metaphor, but basically, here was the best guy in the game, but the coach didn't really like him. There wasn't an easy role in the team, and you had to put him in the game, but you didn't have to give him the ball. And that's what I think they kind of did with him. That being said, I think there was optimism, but it was poorly conceived. And we do this in the film. There was a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department. And this is, to him, was important. The day his job was announced, Senator George Mitchell, was announced as a special envoy to the Middle East. And my father said to me, Dave, the deal is an envoy reports to the Secretary of State, a special representative reports to the President and to the Secretary of State. That was important to him. Although it didn't much matter because his office was in the State Department, so he's considered a diplomat and not a White House, not a chief executive branch. And so that was problematic. I really think they needed to figure something out for him, and they did give him the hardest problem, but it just wasn't going to work. The other thing of this was, in the White House, there was a guy named Doug Lute, who was the special assistant for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that was his job in the White House. And so it's like, on a film, I wouldn't have a director of photography and a photography director. I just wouldn't have it. It wouldn't. It's not that I wouldn't have a director of photography and an assistant camera or a director of photography, but the idea that Doug Lute, and you guys know Washington enough, it's territorial as hell. People are fighting for their turf. They're impassioned. And Doug Lute's in the White House, and so he's the special assistant. And Bob Woodward went into this and said it just wasn't going to work. It was poorly conceived. And one of the things I think also really sidelined my father, he would have been much better in a second Obama administration, where Obama really was open diplomatic achievements. If you look at Cuba, Myanmar, and of course Iran, those were deals, those were decisions I don't think the president could have made in his first term. He got the confidence, he got the ability, but I think the first term it was about the generals. And we have a very disturbing picture of him surrounded by all these generals, and that's who, and respect for the generals. My father believed fully in the American military, but he also knew that his counterpart, his military counterpart, was David Petraeus. And Petraeus had more planes at his disposal than my father had phones. It was such a disparate thing, and that became really problematic. And if you look at Obama's first picks, his national security advisor, civilian job, was General Jim Jones. His ambassador in Afghanistan was General Carl Eikenberry. General Doug Lute was the civilian, on the White House. And I think that's what caused so many problems from the get-go. But it, I don't know really what was in their heart or their head when they conceived it, but it was odd, and it was poorly conceived and even worse executed. I mean, it was kind of doomed to fail. And my father, because he doesn't let it give up till the end, as you said. I mean, he collapsed in Hillary Clinton's office, where that day he came rushing in. It's all in the film, and that morning he had a meeting with David Axelrod, pleading with David Axelrod to go see the president. He felt if he could get 15 minutes alone with the president, he could explain to him his view of how we could get out of this endless war, this forever war. Instead, Axelrod says no, then he has to go do this, and then he comes rushing into Hillary Clinton's office, and his heart goes, and 3 days later he's dead. But it was, it was full on. He wouldn't give up, and I always think that's such a beautiful lesson, even though it ultimately killed him. Yeah, back there. I guess I would have to have a better sense of specifics. Public opposition, he was well aware of let's talk about Bosnia, how hard it was to send troops, American troops, into Bosnia, into a war we didn't understand, people we didn't understand, names we didn't know. We didn't know who was the good guy. And this is what he called Vietnamalia syndrome, that we still are so scarred from Vietnam and Mogadishu, and seeing our troops being dragged through the streets. And so you have a White House that's run on it's the economy's stupid, it's domestic, and here we are in a situation where, we really going to do this? And Clinton's White House advisors, I think, in a way, were hoping that Dayton would fail. That it was easier to say, hey, we gave it our best, but these guys wouldn't come to terms, than us having troops in there, an election year with something going wrong. And 20 years later, not a single shot's been fired in anger, no Americans and no Bosnians have been killed. That's an amazing thing, to have that long a time. And that's a testament to a bunch of things. But in the end, he was acutely aware. And President Clinton told me, he said, my father had an unusual gift for a diplomat to really understand political considerations. That, he understood that was going to be a problem. And for him, it was always aware of it, but it might not be the driver in what he was trying to do.
Oh, yes.
Sure. Sure. I was always. Yeah. Yeah, look, it was my story of his life. That was where I always had to be, was I to tell that. And it's my story. It's not your story, not your story, not, it was my story, and I had that perspective. And there was so much I could have included. There's so much I chose to and didn't, and vice versa. And I was never going to be objective. People say that to me a lot. Your film was so open-eyed. It was so objective. Like his son, I'm not objective. However, the mantra for me in the edit room always was honest but loving. you know, that I could give, you know, a portrait. But I also, and it was one of the reasons I made the film. Somebody was going to make a documentary about my father, and hell, if I was going to sit there and be like, this doesn't ring true to me. You know, I wasn't going to let somebody else as a filmmaker tell this story that was so close to me, and that was a big driver for this. When I grappled with what I want to do, it, the thing that was the most, it was like, I'm not going to be in that audience watching a movie that doesn't feel real, and so it was really hard to get right, and you know, there are people in my family who would say, well, you know, you missed that, or you didn't do that, and there are people in Kosovo who say, why do you fast forward through Kosovo? And Kosovo's in the film. The people who worked for him, who was with us last night, Mark, who watched from the UN and say, like, wait, the UN was his highest ranking job, he had these huge accomplishments, and in a 103-minute movie, that's in there for 3 minutes. You know, so it was always, and I think, you know, it's about telling a story, ultimately, that he had a story, and it unfolds at the beginning, middle, and end. It has 3 acts. It has a narrator, it has a great subject, and that's what it ultimately was. And we had, my editor would say, I was like, we haven't mentioned this, and this was really important. And he did this, he goes, we always said we're not going to make a laundry list of what he did. That doesn't make a good movie. And so I always approached it as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, as someone who cares about narrative, who cares about conflict and all the things that we put into movies. And so I really approached it as that. And George Packer, the New Yorker writer, who wrote a terrific piece about him in 2009 when he was alive, 2009, he's writing a biography, and it'll be 700 pages. And I'm sure I'll be like, how come you didn't write about that in your 700? But that's going to be George's story of his life. And I'm sure there'll be things in there that will frustrate me. I'm sure there'll be things that will touch me, all these parts of it. But, you know, that's ultimately, I think, the right afforded to the storyteller, to the director, to the author. And I, you know, and I'm proud of what we accomplished. And I do think, you know, sentiment, emotion, love, all, you know, are all in that. You know, somebody said to me that, you know, ultimately this was a labor of love. What I was really touched was a woman who's at the State Department who came to our Tribeca premiere. And she said, David, you know what this is? This is a love letter to diplomats. And we don't get a lot of that. We don't get a lot of movies on HBO. You know, here we are with Game of Thrones, and here we are with all this stuff that's on HBO, and we have this movie that looks at all these, you know, this history and all these things that are so hard to do. And you know, if you look at especially films about Bosnia coming out of America, I can count. I've had 2, and 2 of the people who have made them are in this room. You know, I mean, seriously, you know, that it's just not a place in the world that we paid a lot of attention to. So many Vietnam films, so many films about other intrigue, but here's this thing, and I'm sorry, Jesse, but the hunting party, like, is so crystal clear, explains this conflict right at the beginning. You see this film, and this is, you know, Richard Gere, and it's Jesse, and it's all these people rambling all over, and it's really good, and it's not fact. I mean, you know, our fixer Philippe Dupre was one of our guy on the ground, and he told me a lot about the making of it, and he's a great guy, and he's a Belgian who had seen a photo out of Sarajevo of a Serbian soldier with a cigarette in his hand, a rifle over his shoulder, with his leg getting back, and there was a woman on the ground, lying on the ground, and he's lining up his kick to kick her on the ground. And this guy saw this journalist and saw it and said, what the hell is going on there? I need to understand it. Went down there and got immersed in all this other stuff. And I don't know if he's still living there, they've just recently moved. But, you know, from the United States perspective, for a country we've been so involved in, and it's almost like it's not a secret war, but it's certainly a shadow war, and that we don't know much about. And the hunting party, bless its heart, tells you what happened right at the beginning, all the facts, and then it goes on its wonderful narrative twists, some of which are real, some of which aren't. That's great. And I think, you know, for me, one of the things I realized, somebody tried, and I'm still trying to figure this out, but my father's book, To End a War, is the history of his involvement. And a producer optioned it for a while and tried to make it into a narrative feature. And his pitch, which is a great pitch, and stuck with me, is there are countless films about making war. How many are there about making peace? Almost none, you know, and so that to me, you know, the Diplomat is a film about making peace. It's a documentary. I want to see a narrative. You know, watch Diplomacy if you haven't seen that, the Volker Schlonder film. beautiful film about a Norwegian, a Swedish diplomat who's working with a German general to save Paris at the end of World War II. And the general's been told, what's the general's name? I should know this, but he's been told by Hitler to burn down Paris. And this diplomat sneaks into his chambers and gets him, and it's a chamber drama. It's beautifully done. But there's so few films like that, and I think it's really important to be able to use this medium to that effect.
Well, David, it's been a real pleasure.
Hi, pleasure.
We didn't know each other before. It's been really personally great for me to have a chance to meet you after having been so influenced by your dad. My wife, Elaine, said yesterday that she used to call him Dick.
Yeah, not at all. It was his name for a long time. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
To say he was, that Dick was her other husband, because he would call, I said this last night, he knew exactly when we were about to go to sleep, and would call us at that very moment.
Yeah, it's like a sixth sense. Well, the Dick Richard thing is probably a little bit to your, his missteps. When he went to interview with the President of the United States, my father had been Dick Holbrooke publicly for a long time, but he also became Richard Holbrooke. It's a more dignified name, obviously. And his third wife really wanted him to be more dignified, which was a tricky thing for a guy who loved the Marx Brothers and loved, silly movies and silly everything. He was this big character, and so he goes in to see the President-elect of the United States, who says, Dick, it's really good to meet you or see you. And my father says to the President-elect, I'd really appreciate if you called me Richard. It would mean a lot to me and to my wife. And I still am stunned by how ham-handed, how dopey that was, how for such a smart guy. And it's something beautiful that he's paying tribute to his wife in a way. But it's the President of the United States. Call me whatever you want. Call me, and the President told other people about that, and they denigrated him and they made fun of him because he was like that, and he didn't have the good sense to say, we'll figure out this name thing later, Barry. He wasn't that. But he couldn't help himself, and so the Dick Richard thing is this thing that's in the film, and it's been written about, and he really he didn't get it. And I think, to me, that's the thing. He was a great man. He was a great man. There's no doubt about me. But one of the things I think I knew, but I really learned, is great men, great women, great people all have great flaws, and their flaws, unlike us normal people, run deeper and his did, and it's what allowed him in some ways to accomplish everything he did, and it's also what in the end was his downfall in the Obama administration, that the tragedy we talked about last night, that sadly he couldn't achieve what he felt could be achieved there, and here we are.
All right, well,
hey, thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.